and people will start joining us here soon. We are recording, by the way. Looks like people are starting to pile in. I actually didn't check. I don't know if you checked, Terry, to see what our registration was before the event.
67 as of just about an hour and a half ago.
Great. Awesome. Well,
I can make my announcements.
People a few minutes. Okay.
You want me to start now?
Just wait.
Okay, wait a little while.
Just 1 minute.
You got it.
Maybe the rate at which people are entering will slow down slightly. All right, it seems like we've got about 25 people so far on the line. If you would like to go ahead and kick us off, Terry, that would be fabulous.
Thanks, Amy. My name is Terry Campbell. I'm one of the co-founders of Sustainable Building Week, and we're happy to have this event presented by Bora today. Our goal at Sustainable Building Week is to foster an industry of collaborators who can deepen Portland and the greater nation and world sustainability goals. So Sustainable Building Week was founded 3 years ago, and this year we took everything virtual, as many events are, and we're really happy with the robust schedule, as you can see on the screen now, that is going to continue this week and flow through next week. So we really encourage folks to look at events and register. There are several that have continuing education opportunities, and most of them are free. There are a couple of workshops that do require some fees. sustainablebuildingweek.org, .com is the website that you can go to look at all the schedule and get registered. On that website, we also have a email newsletter that you can sign up for. I promise you, we only use your email for this type of communication, and we really kind of limit the amount of email to probably less than 10 a year, and it's very much frequent in the lead up to each week of events. So SBW 20 could not be possible without our great sponsors. This year, our top level sponsors were Malum, Henneberry Eddy, Architects, Holst, Bora, PAE, NBI, Sustainable Northwest Wood, PGE, the Associated Builders and Contractors of the Pacific Northwest, Crane Hammer, Pivot Partners, E-Terriers, and Brightworks. And with that, I really hope you enjoy the week. And thank you, Bora, for putting on this great event. I'll go back to mute and enjoy the show.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Terry. We are excited to be here. So for everybody on the line, I'm Amy Running with Bora Architects. And I'm joined here by a team of individuals from our office who are all been very involved in our sustainability efforts. And before we get going here, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of the webinar format, which is brand new for us. We are, this is our first live webinar that is also being recorded. So I wanted to just run through a couple of things with you. We are going to be using the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. That is the best way to send questions to our panelists, and we are reserving time at the end of each section as well as at the end of the entire presentation for some Q&A. You are welcome to use the chat, though we won't be checking that as frequently because it just kind of continues as a scroll. And then I just wanted to forewarn everybody, as I've started doing now, we will be showing slides. So make sure that you've kind of set up your screen so that you can actually see the items on your screen and on the slides. All right, so for us here at Bora, as well as for some of you, 2020 has really brought some challenges And as you can see, each of us are joining from our own homes here. Our office is closed, and we're all working to maintain professional relationships and collaboration in this virtual world. During this time, we've really taken stock of our firm priorities and used the opportunity to better articulate our focuses around sustainability. Our office has renewed, sorry, I'm losing my notes here, has renewed our goals and really focused them around a new vision. And that vision is simply our design approach centers on health and equity, manifesting deeply rooted humanistic values in the pursuit of a low carbon future. Now, this is really a evolution of work that we've been doing over decades as a firm in the realm of sustainability and efforts outside of our office, including involvement in the Health Product Declaration and our firm's JUST label. We're really excited to step forward and think about these new goals and what this focused effort really means to our work and the profession in the future. We will be hearing from several staff focused on these different efforts, first looking at health, then equity, and last carbon. And I just want to highlight this Creekside High School image. This is a high school that is both really looking at equity across the Tigard-Tualatin School District, co-locating different learning programs in one campus. It also is seeking a net zero certification, as well as really supporting the health of the community through a substantial community garden. And this was a project that was actually completed this last year, but is the opportunity to just highlight it briefly. So to start our discussion off, we will be hearing from Mike Manzi, as well as Jake Kennedy. Mike's the specifications manager at Bora. He's part of our technical committee, as well as the technical co-chair for the Health Product Declaration Collaborative and one of its founding board members. Jake Kennedy, we're so happy to have him join. He is not a Bora employee. He is a Portland State graduate student studying environmental economics and sustainability. He has a background in supply chain sustainability within the outdoor recreation industry. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Mike and Jake.
Thanks, Amy. So you can go to the next slide. So fundamentally, we realize that in order to design healthy buildings, we need a supply of non-toxic materials to build with. So this has driven us to really be engaged with others in the industry that are trying to reduce the amount of toxic materials that are used in our building products. And we're very encouraged over the last decade or so with all of the collaboration that has happened among owners and architects, and especially manufacturers and material and health organizations that like Cradle to Cradle and ILFI that help rate these products and get us into healthy products. And there's a lot of guidance available for numerous product types out there, product categories, making it easier to select and make healthier choices. But all of this has also made product selection really complicated. So when we had the opportunity this summer to engage with a researcher to really look into this, we decided to focus on what is the current status of all of this information out there, and how do we prioritize what the next step should be and how we can get engaged in that. So Jake's going to start by talking about this research program that he directed for us this summer and the process that he used to organize our data. And then I'll come back and talk about what we learned from that and what do we do next. So Jake.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Amy. Like Amy said, I am not a Bora employee. I came to work with Bora this summer through this program called the Oregon Applied Sustainability Experience. It's put on in partnership between the Oregon Sea Grant and Oregon DEQ and funded partly by the EPA Pollution Prevention Grant. And the idea is to increase the number of projects implemented by Oregon businesses preventing waste and pollution. And so that's kind of how I came to work alongside Bora. And our project was also heavily supported in part through an ongoing research project in partnership with the HBD Collaborative and Arizona State. So a huge thanks to Wendy Vittori, the ED of HBDC, as well as Indrayud Mandal, who is a PhD researcher at ASU. They did a lot of heavy lifting getting the original data set. Next slide, Amy, please. So my project at the outset, as defined kind of by the OASIS project and Bora, was to explore and take this HBD repository data and existing industry knowledge and look at the health and that impacts, specifically human health impacts of building materials specified in these projects. The goal was to kind of provide some simple guidelines for designers. Mike will speak a little bit more about that later in the presentation. For designers to be able to make more informed product specification choices. We also knew that going into it, that we were going to identify a lot of gaps in research and further analysis needed. And so that was kind of one of the outliers of the observations we knew heading into it. So the key for us to move on to, or I guess, build upon the HBD repository data was to look at category types and product types of materials rather than specific products. So the resources that we kind of utilized, like I said just a second ago, the HBDC and Arizona State HBD repository data, which was at the product level. We were actually then able to leverage Pharos's chemical database and green screens to associate each of those products' chemical compositions with the health impact data. So Mike will speak a little bit more about green screen in a few slides here when I hand it back. Next, we were actually able to kind of leverage current industry relevant product databases beyond the HBD repository and certifications like Declare, the living products through the Living Product Challenge, and then cradle to cradle certifications. And then lastly, we heavily relied on some industry specific and industry leading specification guidelines, such as HBN's Home Free and the Building Green Spec This, Not That specific guidelines. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to kind of give you a roadmap for where the rest of me and Mike's presentation will go, some of the key observations that we learned over this summer project, these kind of outlined 4 of the top ones. Specifically, I'll speak a little bit in just a second on the first one, the key to identify better ways to categorize products within these data sets. And then number 2, being able to identify or better understand the role and the functions of these hazardous substances that we identify within products, what they're doing to what function they are performing within the products, so that we can better understand alternative chemistry and replacement products. Number 3, prioritizing the list of substances for further assessment. So one of the things that we discovered was the large number of the products relevant to Bora's projects we still know very little about. Mike will speak a little bit more on the percentages around those, but being able to kind of industry-wide look at where the next steps are for identifying and understanding the chemical substances that are ending up in our building materials. And then just having data is not enough. This idea that one of the key observations we realized was, even though we started the project with a very large data set, being able to translate that into actionable building material specifications and decision guidelines was very hard for people who don't have a expertise in chemistry or human health impact knowledge or medical knowledge. And so this need to be able to take these large data sets and translate them into specific on the ground actionable information. Next slide, please, Amy. And so the scope of my project and kind of the bulk of the majority of the work that I did this summer was specified by Bora and taking this large HBD repository data set and making it useful to the types of projects Bora specifically does, prioritizing the adjacency and prevalence of building materials. So being able to isolate the categories of materials that were going to be adjacent to human contact kind of led to the whittling down into these 7 prioritized categories: wall construction, wall finishes, ceiling finishes, et cetera. And then the likelihood of exposure and the method of exposure that some of these substances could get to in regards to human health. So inhalation, ingestion, and dermal absorption. And this kind of led to the understanding of what we described in observation 1, that it was a large bulk of bandwidth and work to take individual products specific data from that HBD repository and seamlessly and objectively categorize them into these categories, specifically with relevancy to Bora's. The need to be able to identify better ways to whittle this information and make this large data set relevant to industries and to the firms that are utilizing this information was a key factor that could save a lot of bandwidth, a lot of time, a lot of energy, and be able to help utilize and move better specification guides forward. And next slide, Amy. So like I said, what we started with was about 34,000 lines of data. The full HBD repository downloaded each specific product that has an HBD along with each specific chemical substance within that product. So it was a large chunk of data, about 42,000 products. And then as we spent our time and effort, in large part with the help of the expertise of both Amy and Mike, we were able to whittle it down to 509 specific products that were relevant to the categories that you just saw on the slide that really have specificity towards what Bora's unique products are doing. So taking that much data and making it relevant to the firm that needs to utilize it is a large amount of work, but that could be streamlined if we had clearer and more identifiable ways to categorize these things, not at the product level, but at the product type level. In addition, as we compiled all of those HBD resources, we added to them with Declare Living Product and Cradle to Cradle certified products at that product level to further identify what alternatives, better alternatives, or additional products were relevant to the categories that we had identified and compiled them into that list as well. And so all of this bulk of this data work kind of leads towards that first observation of a streamlined or a better way to objectively categorize these products at the individual product level into larger product types so that we can make easier, more streamlined, informed specification guides. Next slide, Amy. Which is summed up with this first observation. So I'll hand you back to Mike to walk you through the next few observations and the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake. You can go to the next slide, Amy. So after we got all of the data organized into a way that sort of represents the typical Bora specification, we were able to learn a lot more about that, and I'll go through that now. First, a quick primer on how hazards are handled with HBDs. Primarily, we use the green screen method. And green screen, if chemicals are assessed, they're assigned a benchmark score of 1 through 4, with 1 being the most toxic and 4 being the least toxic or benign. If they're not assessed, they're assigned a list translator score. And LT1 would mean that it would most likely be a benchmark 1. LTP1 means it's probably a benchmark 1, so there's a little ambiguity there. But and for our purposes, we basically lumped all of those together as hazardous. LT-UNC means essentially that there's not quite enough data to say that it's a benchmark 1, but without further assessment, you can't really say for sure what it is. And no GS essentially means that there's no data, and there's no score, there's not enough data. So essentially a third of the substances that we looked at across all of these product types that were, tailored to our Bora sort of typical specification were hazardous. And nearly 2/3 of them fell into these ambiguous either LT-UNC or no GS category. And ultimately what we want is that small 6% slice to really be the whole pie. So there's some work to do there. So next, please. Using the HPD data, we were able to identify the list of the hazardous substances that are used the most in these product types. And we graphed the ones that show up in the most product types in each of the big categories that we studied, especially the ones that we had really good data for. So I'll just let you absorb for a second. All of these substances, you may recognize some of them from, I'm sure several of you have done this kind of research on products already. So there's a lot of data here. But so you can go next, Amy. Essentially, this led to our second observation, which is that we really need to figure out what these functions are that these substances are doing, and see if there are substances out there that are safer that we can do the same function with. And then if there are, really encourage manufacturers to switch to that safer chemistry. Next, Amy. So likewise, we uncovered this list of substances that fall under these ambiguous scores of LT-UNC and no GS. And one thing about this, some of these may turn out to be hazardous, but there also might be a missed opportunity here to really encourage the use of the substances here that aren't hazardous. And we don't really know that because there's not enough data. So next, Amy. So this led to our third observation, which is really just to encourage more of these substances to be studied fully and get a full benchmark assessment that's made public. And the research that ASU and HBDC has done has already encouraged this. So Green Screen is already working hard to try to increase the number of these substances that have these full assessments. Next, Amy. So next we'll look at the available data across all of the product categories that we looked at. And you can see here that categories like flooring have gotten a lot of attention over the last several years. And there's a lot of data, there's a lot of HBDs, there's a lot of declare labels, and even a lot of cradle-to-cradle products. By far the most in this category over the other categories. And then there are some categories where there's just not that much data at all. So it's hard to know what we're specifying. And yet some of these are also in the interior spaces. And as Jake was saying, these are close to where people are and really have an impact on people's health. So next slide. So Jake also mentioned the Home Free program and the Spec This Not That product guide from Building Green. And these guides really provide informed analysis by giving straightforward guidance on what to use and what kind of things to look out for. And as you can see, they don't cover all of the categories either. And Home Free really is a guide that's modeled to study affordable housing. So it's not surprising that things like visual display are not included in that guide. But we do a lot of education and a lot of office projects, so we use a lot of those kinds of products. So maybe what we need is a school-free and an office-free program to get the information that we need across all product types that we use. So next, Amy. So to sort of explain the importance of that kind of information, we'll take a look at a common product choice option here, vinyl flooring versus linoleum flooring. And you can see by just looking at the raw HPD data here, there are hazardous substances and there are ambiguous substances, in pretty much all of these types of products. Next slide, Amy. So you could dig into the Pharos database and really try to understand this information, but most of us are not really qualified, I don't think, to understand this. I'm certainly not. You might know that PVC, for example, has a lot of life cycle issues associated with it, which is one of the reasons that it's considered, generally considered a more sort of worse chemical than some of the others. But you might not know that much about ferric oxide, which I certainly didn't when I started digging into this. So next slide, Amy. So luckily, we have these other programs, Home Free and the Spec This, Not That guide, that make it very clear that the vinyl flooring is the worst in class and the linoleum flooring is the best in class. So next slide. So this brings us to our final big observation, which is that just having the data is not really enough. We need people who are smarter in chemistry and human health to tell us what the data means and what kind of decisions we should make about that. So next slide, Amy. So through this research, I think we have a much clearer picture now of the ways to improve the tools that we use to collect the data so that we can analyze things more efficiently. We've prioritized chemicals that we should be phasing out, and we've prioritized chemicals that need further study. And we also know the importance of encouraging broader input from people that can help make smarter decisions with this type of data. So next, Amy. In the meantime, though, Bora, we're doing what we can with this kind of information. We've created these internal material selection guides. There's an example here for flooring. And within that is all of the product types that we typically specify in flooring. And we're looking at both the material health, which we've started to update based on the research we've just done. And we're also looking at carbon. And we're going to be updating that on the research that you're going to hear about from Garrett in a few minutes. And these will obviously continue to evolve as the industry evolves. And I'm convinced that eventually we'll get to the place where we can really make the healthy choice, the easy choice. And that's it.
Great. Thank you, Mike and Jake, for walking us through your research. I do encourage everyone, if you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead and add that in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. I do have a couple of questions for you guys at the moment. So, Mike, there's a question here about, so how are we actually incorporating these findings? You mentioned the spec guides, but how do you see that actually being adopted in our office in terms of our practice?
So one thing I think is the idea around the material selection guides is really to just give a snapshot to our designers who they don't dig into this every day, and they aren't into the nuance of all of this health information the way that Amy, that you and I are in our involvement with HPD and other organizations. So just providing them this sort of snapshot on, here's the place to start thinking about what makes the most sense in terms of health and carbon. And we've also in that included some manufacturers that are recommended, that are ones that we know are producing HPDs. They have Declare products, they have Cradle products. So within that also there's specific guidance on what things to look out for. And in certain cases, a product type might be in the red category, like the worst category, but there might be some available products that are Cradle or Declare. And so that would be a signal to them to go look for those types of products in that situation.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to see personally how we start expanding some of those categories we haven't had as much data on in the future as we start to plug in some of those holes. And I know teams in our office are excited to share that research across projects to make sure that we're really bringing up all of our work in the office. So thank you on that. Let's see here. It looks like we've had another Do you have a material section guide for kitchen cabinetry, and does it have any clear recommendations?
So we do have casework is one of the material categories that we produced a guide for. And at the moment, the research we found, there's a fair amount of information on substrates, which kind of comes down to formaldehyde or not, as you might expect. And then there's some information on some countertop products and things like that. This is a category that the Home Free has done some research on. So if you go to Home Free, you can see, especially any sort of casework or cabinetry type of things that you would see in an affordable housing project. Those are pretty well covered by the Home Free guide. But so yeah, so there weren't a ton of products in our research from that, but there is the guidance in the Home Free guide, so that's helpful.
All right, we've got one more question here. How can we capture the lessons of this amazing type of analysis? The landscape of product chemistry is actively evolving. The experience of watching material labels expire or develop over the course of a project is eye-opening. Can the A&E industry have an advocacy role at the new product development stage to start with better chemistry?
Certainly, that we would love to have that role. And I think one of, Bora specifically, we've been engaged with HPD, the HPD Collaborative, and with the Portland Materials Transparency Collaborative for a number of years. So my hope is to take this message, that what we learned in this research, to those groups and say, hey, here are the things that we think we need to do next, and we need everybody's help. So how can you help? How can you help us do this? How can we encourage manufacturers to pay attention to these substances that we've identified, and either provide the more data where it's needed, or start to look for healthier alternative to some of the hazardous materials? I don't know if that totally answers the question, but.
Well, it's a start, I would say, Mike. I know one thing we've talked about as well, and have been reaching out to some groups, is just what would it take from an economic standpoint to get some of this private chemistry data in terms of the chemistry scoring to be made more public. And I know there are groups that are working on that, but it also makes me wonder what advocacy we can do in our individual work or in our local communities to help further some of that.
Yeah.
All right, well, we are going to move on. If you have more questions for Mike or about this health section, please go ahead and add those to the Q&A, and we will continue to answer those when we get to the end of the presentation. All right, so I wanted to transition now to equity. And Jeannie Lai, who is a design principal at Bora, Jeannie leads both efforts in our design and fabrication, very involved in our Bora laboratory team, as well as designing with intention and openness with such clients such as Portland Community College and their new Metro Center project. So Jeannie, I am going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Amy. Equity, I think, as a topic is still relatively new within the overall discussion of sustainability. We've been really focused as a profession on energy and resources. But, if 3 or 4 years ago you brought up social issues within a sustainability discussion, I think you would have gotten some confused looks from your peers. But all that is changing. Next, please. Our profession is realizing just how connected social issues are with climate change. Not only do we need to step up our game in fighting climate change, we have the responsibility as a profession to create climate justice and not leave the most vulnerable people behind. Next. And this is clearer than ever right now. with rising temperatures around the nation, studies are showing in LA, in a city like LA, they're finding that African Americans are twice as likely to die from a heat wave than other LA residents. The air the communities of color are breathing in their neighborhoods are 40% more polluted than white communities across the US. And a recent New York Times article showed a direct connection between the racial discriminatory practice of redlining and temperature. I'm sure many of you have read that article. It found that the lack of investment in these formerly redlined neighborhoods across 100 cities in the US on average was 5 degrees hotter, sometimes up to 12 degrees hotter than areas that was favored by this housing loans. And when you think about it now, it makes sense, since some of these neighborhoods often lack the investments of trees and parks and other amenities to help cool the air. But even if you didn't know or were familiar with these past kind of systematic practices, you can just look at today, right? Look at right now, the coronavirus, how it's impacting the people of color. 2020 has really magnified all the social inequalities to a point that none of us can keep kind of ignoring it. This is a really big opportunity for us to not only address climate change with new great regenerative ideas for buildings and cities, but we need to do more to care for the people that are living in the environments that we help to create, that our institutions and systems have explicitly and implicitly left behind. Next. Many of you have probably seen these 4 words a lot lately, often shortened to JEDI. Many of us are familiar with them, but many others are not, at least not in these contexts, right? There's a lot of new terms coming around. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusions are just a few of them. Next. I think the 2 that I find most often asked about is the difference between equity and equality. Those are 2 terms that I think, we've seen a lot of, many of you have probably seen a lot of graphics that try to illustrate the differences. I really like this one by Tony Ruth. And you can see equality is giving everyone the same tools and assistance. So in this case, the same ladder and bag. And equality is and equity, is accounting for the difference of kind of circumstances and offering different tools and assistance with that in mind to help everyone sort of succeed. So in this case, it would be a taller ladder. Why this graphic is interesting to me is that it illustrates that even when the people involved are depicted, in this case, very similarly, they have outward, physical appearance are similar. The apple tree, the environment alone, in this case, is a source of bias. And that's really true in our world as well. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. In the real world also, though, each of us are different, and that compounds the inequalities and the problems that we need to solve. Next. There are a lot of complexity to this issues, and most of us are very committed to doing more and better, but often don't know where to start and what to do. At Bora, we've been focusing on 3 topics: critical race theory, design justice, and equitable practice. And we're providing training on all of these items, all of these areas, with the ultimate goal that we are going to train all of our staff on all 3 of them in the next year. And Bora is very fortunate, as Amy mentioned, to be working with Portland Community College, who is very invested in critical race theory and is a leader in applying that in their facilities and planning and construction group. And we're currently working on critical race theory and design justice as lenses for the work on the project that we're working with. I want to touch on these pretty quickly. I only really have time to brush on them quickly, and hopefully if you don't already know too much about them, it will inspire you to learn a little bit more. So I'll start with critical race theory, which comes from the social sciences. It examines society and culture as it relates to the category of race, law, and power. It's been most studied in law, proposing that racism is ingrained in the fabric of American society, that our laws and justice systems created by the dominant culture are used to maintain white privilege and supremacy. So you wonder, next please, wonder how this directly applies to architecture and the environment. I want to start with something that's not directly been linked to CRT per se, but important, I think, to sort of understanding how it relates to architecture. Is this idea of the theory of affordances. It's a theory out of the field of psychology on perception, and it was coined by the psychologist J.J. Gibson in the 60s. And he states that the world is perceived not only in terms of object shapes and spatial relationships, but also in terms of the object's possibilities for action. So he coined that to be affordances. And more simply put, is that we perceive our environment, it influences our actions and behaviors. I think many of us who might not have heard of this theory before, I think really understands that, right? We're all in this industry and we understand that what we design matters. A quick example of this is meeting spaces, right? If you look at, I think it's pretty safe to say, two different spaces, one that's a more corporate kind of formal conference room on the left and a tiered open area on the right. We would feel differently if we were in meetings in these spaces. Not only that, but some of us might feel very intimidated to be in a conference room, much like on the left. And maybe our stress levels, our blood pressure goes up, and we can really be impacted by this and how we present our ideas at this meeting. And in some extreme cases, I can imagine that we really bomb our presentation, and maybe we could even get fired. That's pretty extreme, but the point is that what architects and designers are, the decisions that we make, we hold power in those decisions, and that these decisions really matter and have real impacts. So going back to CRT, next please. CRT really looks at this idea, and that it posits that space is never neutral. So each of us perceive our spaces differently, and that's based on our lived experiences and our identity. So identity is a combination of things. It's not just gender or just race, but a combination of all of those things: ethnicity, sexuality, our class, our age, our ability, etc. So it's all a combination of that. Let's take, for an instance, you're a female corporate lawyer and you've been doing it for 30 years, and you find yourself one day unexpectedly thinking you're going to go meet at a conference room like on the left from the slide before, but you end up, having to meet in a tiered step kind of space. And you might feel really out of place. You're wearing a suit, you're wearing a skirt, it's totally uncomfortable, and it really distracts you. So it can work, I think, in many different ways. The point being that I think it all depends on your experience and the intersectionality of your identity, which is what Dr. Omar Perez, who's been working with PCC, really talks about. Next. So what do we do? I think number one is that we need to ask ourselves what we, when we design spaces, to really critically think about the impact that it might have to the people that are using the space. And that's especially true for public spaces and buildings, which Bora focuses on majority of the time. So the other is to better understand the people we designed, and, not to just posit what they might be thinking, but to really ask them. So, not just ask about functional requirements, which we often do, right? How big a table needs to be, what are the equipment, what size of things, but really focus on also qualitative questions and talk to people about how they use their space, how they want to feel about their space, and how it influences them as well. So often we, the people making decisions on our projects are leaders of companies or institutions. And oftentimes they're not everyday users of the buildings, but they're making those decisions. And so I think as a start, we need to ask our clients to include a mix of users into the design process. Next. With design justice, I think it takes all of these concepts from critical race theory, but also affords this optimistic vision of action. What can we do about that? That we can use design, the power of design as a process as well, to repair these past injustices and to make for a better future. Next. Design justice looks at the design profession as an institution. And like all institution, it imposes its power and leverages privilege. All institutions are subjected to their own inherited biases, and we're no different in architecture. Next, let's think about the history of social housing development and urban design in this country. As a design profession, we have supported these ideas. We've putting them forward as improvements. We're fighting diseases. We're making the city more beautiful. We're creating better access. All our designs are for the better, but who's it better for? It's not better for all the houses that needed to be demolished to cut through to create this highway. It's not better for the communities that got divided in half. So design justice is asking us to think hard about that. Who is it better for when we say better? Maybe we believe all of this was good, but the reality is that we benefit from this work, right? It was projects for us, and none of us lived in these communities, so it didn't impact us. Design justice would say it is not, if we're not critically questioning what we're doing, then we're complicit in it. So not only that, but we should be protesting and actively working to dismantle the privileged power that we have that we're working in. Next. So design justice lays out a path for the design professions to start sharing that power, to share that power with the communities, to help them decide for themselves what they need and what they want. So through outreach, engagement, and organizing, those are different levels of doing that. And I just wanted to point out quickly that these are not the same things. They are often sort of used interchangeably, but there are really kind of differences between them. And the hope is that we organize the communities to fight for what they want themselves, and not just outreach and tell them what we're doing. Next. So all of this bring sort of back to the architecture profession at large, and the AIA has put out a guide for equitable practice pretty recently, and it realizes that the profession has a lot to do to improve on diversity and create better, more inclusive practice. Next, so hopefully many of you have seen that, but honestly, it's a long time coming. Whitney Young Jr., the civil rights leader and the president of the National Urban League back in the 60s, he gave a talk in 1968 at the AIA convention in Portland, this very city that we're in, over 50 years ago. And he said that this profession really needs to do more. He said, as a profession, we were, and I quote, most distinguished by our thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance to speak out on issues of civil rights. So as a white male-dominant profession, especially in the 1960s, civil rights and equity was simply not our problem. So he pointed out that this lack of diversity in the profession has both made the profession of, in itself, full range of creativity and talent, but also, and more importantly, we were denying communities of color the opportunity to be part of the charting their own future. So if you haven't read this speech, I really think you should. The the transcript is available on the AIA website, and I really hope that you. And honestly, the speech could have been given yesterday, and it's really, really sobering to kind of read it. I read it again recently, so please go and find that. Next. There were some outcomes out of his speech. The AIA developed the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and established some scholarships and the Whitney M. Young Award. So, but, 50 years, I said, right? Looking at these numbers today or in 2018, the professions really hasn't changed much in terms of diversity. These are pretty low numbers. Next. Recruitment is certainly important, and scholarships do help, but we need to do more as a profession. We need to start younger. We need to find kids and give kids reasons to study architecture in the first place, right? We need to go out to high schools and middle schools and elementary schools. And we're not doing a lot of that, and the AIA isn't really helping to push that. Why is architecture worth their time? We really have to, I think, share that with communities of color. Doctors are doing that, and I think architects need to do that as well. But it's not just about recruitment, it's also about retention. Back to the sort of previous graphic of the ladder, right? We do need different tools and trainings. We can't treat everybody the same. So next, I think women in the profession is a really good example of this problem that we have on retention. So, women are interested in the profession. We know this because we see numbers, right? 43% of total architecture students in 2012 to 2013 were women. But in 2020, only 17% of the registered architects are women. So we're losing them, right? We're losing us somewhere. What are we doing? What are we not doing that's influenced these numbers? I really hope that we can figure that out quickly and learn from it so that we can retain women and future architects of colors to be leaders in the field. There's a lot of learning and listening and evaluating to do in ourselves, our profession, and the world right now, and we're all feeling that. But I wanted to end kind of before the question, this quote by Mr. Bucky Fuller, who says that, you never change things by fighting against existing realities. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. And I think that's kind of what we need to do. We don't have another 50 years to add a few scholarships. We need to be brave, and we need to be willing to disrupt our current processes, rethink, and create a new model. And let's do that in 5 years, in 10 years, and make some real differences instead of waiting another 50 that we don't have. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Jeannie, for walking us very carefully through all of those deep topics. And I'm sure everybody is just absorbing all of this information. We do have one question that's come through the chat, and I'll throw that out to you. What do you think contributes to a successful workplace JEDI committee, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as I'm assuming what the author wrote?
Yeah. I think, all of us are, especially, Bora has been grappling with this. We have an open committee that we formed to talk about the issues, and we've allowed the sort of interested staff to really establish what the issues they are facing and what they're hearing, and really to establish their own action plan. So I would suggest that really starting conversation is step number one, and not to predetermine that from the leadership.
Great. Jeannie, could you talk a little bit, you mentioned recruitment and retention efforts, about some of those that Bora is taking on, and obviously it's a slow process, but just as we move forward.
I think many of us, including Bora, has been part of programs like Architects in Schools through the years. I think those are great. I think we are working currently on some internship programs and to reach out to colleges and not wait for applicants to come to us and be more proactive. So that's something we are trying to clarify and establish more clearly, and to reach out and help bring people to Portland. I think Portland is pretty isolated in those terms. I think I don't have the kind of information on diversity across, but understanding that it's a little bit better on the East Coast than it is on the West Coast. So with kind of all the things that's happening, if we were back to working in person in our offices, I think for people to move here to Portland is a challenge. Maybe the virtual working is actually better for some of these things, but how can we attract people out to Portland, and how can we help them? I think living costs is often raised as a question. So, are there partnerships? I think this is something that we can't solve as just Bora. I think the profession, though, maybe in the city as a group, maybe we can attack some of these things to help figure out ways that we can at least find affordable ways for students to come to Portland, even if it's a short-term kind of internship program. So we're looking into things like that right now.
Great. Well, I'm just looking here at our Q&A. Just want to remind anybody who's joined mid-presentation, we are taking questions. If you want to post those in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, we will try to answer those either after each of these kind of mini sessions. They're focused on health, equity, and carbon, or at the end, we'll kind of wrap up with some final Q&A as well. So since we don't have any other items in the question dialogue at the moment, I'm going to go ahead and stop share and introduce our last panelist for this last section. So we have with us Garrett Helm. He is an architect at Bora and an active member of our Bora Green team. He has contributed to several of our most sustainable projects in our office, including the local Fabian K-8 school that's a joint partnership, or was a joint partnership with Concordia University as part of Portland Public Schools. And most recently, he's been working on a large tenant improvement project at Microsoft in Washington State. He's going to talk a little bit about a case study from that project and some of our focus on carbon. And let me get his presentation up here on the screen and hand this over to Garrett.
Thank you, Amy. Happy to be here. So we can skip on forward here. As Amy mentioned, we wanted to kind of ground the third part of this in carbon and how we're approaching that at Bora in practice. So if we go on to the next slide, this is certainly one approach, and it's the approach we're taking on this project, which is a large TI with Microsoft, as Amy mentioned. This is relatively new to our firm, as it is to a lot of the industry, kind of this full approach to the carbon intensity of a project. So goal setting from the outset was important. So we're going to talk a little bit about the goals, we'll talk about the process, and then we'll talk about some of the outcome. And it should be noted that this project is still in design. It's in our office. It's kind of slated to go out the door at the end of the month, but it won't be done and occupied until late next winter. So let's go on to the next slide. So, Bora has sustainability goals. We've been kind of evolving our practice in that way. We've worked with USGBC, we've worked with ILFI, And for this project, we were also partnering with Microsoft, who has kind of a new standard for sustainability on their projects, but we wanted to find some goalposts that we thought would kind of really align for this job specifically. So working with ILFI, we talked to them about their zero carbon program, which hasn't really been adapted to TIs. Right now, it's still kind of for a whole building, ground up, core and shell plus TI. So working with them, they kind of put us in this pilot program. Some other large TIs have gone through this process as well. So we're kind of excited to be using those standards. And they have some pretty serious goals around both energy and carbon. So in the energy realm, you're required to do a net annual offset of all your operational energy, which is fairly easy to do with Microsoft as a client because they have a renewable energy sourcing program that aligns with the requirements of the International Living Futures Institute. There's also an EUI target that's required, which we are just honing in on now. Being a TI partner on this project, we don't have control of a lot of the drivers of what the overall end EUI would be because we're coming into a core and shell that's already been developed. So we are driving towards that 32 number, and we're feeling pretty good about it currently. On the carbon side, which is what we want to talk about today, the requirements are a one-time carbon offset for all of the embodied carbon impact of the tenant build out. So that basically means you have to quantify everything you're doing, from the time you arrived on site to the time the occupants moved in, and provide that offset. So the big portion of that for us is tracking all of that information and figuring out what that number is. And then the second part is a demonstrated reduction in interior product categories. So we'll talk a little bit about those as we get into it, but let's move on to the next slide. So seeing how we only have about 15 minutes and we're trying to do big picture here, I just wanted to briefly mention the tools we're using. I'm not going to get too into the details of this process, but it would be wrong of me not to describe just generally how we're doing it. And if anyone has questions about this or wants to check in offline, I'd be happy to do so. As I said, tracking carbon is relatively new to Bora, so we're excited to be kind of getting up to speed along with a lot of our industry peers. Tally is the plugin that we're using with Revit, which was developed out of Kieran Timberlake's office. And similar to a lot of other plugins in Revit, that you might use for visualization or rendering, it allows you to assign material assets to different items in your project kind of as you go, just like you might be assigning a wood material to a door to render it. You would also assign the carbon intensity or value to that. And then using the 3D modeling software, you're kind of automatically quantifying how much of that there is in the project. So it's a really iterative thing, and it allows us to kind of build the information as we go. As I said, we're just still in design, so the results we're getting are kind of in progress. But it's really nice to kind of be able to see where you're going on your way there and not just wait till the end to do a total bulk summary. And then the second tool here is EC3, which was Microsoft was actually a founding partner of, so they're glad to hear that we're using this. And this is software that's tied into Tally, as well as a database of EPDs. So you're able to kind of take your model and all your material assets and then link them up with actual product data that's provided from manufacturers. So you can really see your project through kind of from the Revit model all the way to the submittals when you're in construction. So that's just a brief overview on the tools, and we'll talk a little about the method that we're using. So as I said, this is new to us, but this is specific to this project. Others might have different approaches to carbon, but from the outset, as we started designing, we tried to kind of keep these three things in mind. One is use less, two is choose well, and three is consider the details. So in use less, that's really the one that's on us as designers. Is to just keep in mind that regardless of what material you're using, no matter whether it has a high carbon intensity or low carbon intensity, it's still just the mere fact of using that material is going to have a greater impact than not using it, right? So that use less is the first step, and we'll talk a little bit about some ceiling design reduction strategies that we used once we get into the slides. On the second step, choose well, and this really ties back to what Mike and Jake were talking about. Several of our industry partners have done really well. optimizing their materials and providing the best resources for us, and some are a little further behind. So we'll talk a little about carpet and wood. And then the third is consider the details. And this is really how you're documenting the building. What steps can you take to get there and drive those numbers down? So we'll look at some partition walls. So let's go on and talk a little about the project. So this is a TI move-in in the winter of 21, as I mentioned. It's about 250,000 square feet, a little less, and about 200,000 of that is workplace. So it's 7 floors, 5 floors of workplace, 1 floor that's a big food hall and commercial kitchen. So it's a big, exciting project, and it's also a new core and shell that we're going into. So it's a kind of PT concrete deck with concrete structure, concrete floors, really kind of empty shell that we're trying to fill out, and really trying to embrace some of the elements of biophilia and other sustainable portions, not just talking about carbon over and over again. So what you're seeing here are kind of a linked series of spaces that are more lounge, alternate workspaces that we have throughout the project. And as you can see, we're bringing in a lot of wood and a lot of warmth and a lot of natural elements with planting and carpet and things like that. So just to give a little overview of what we're looking at, we can go on and look at some larger renderings on the next slide. So here's just some enlarged versions of those same images. You can see here these linear wood slats, which are ceiling and wall systems, are a big element of the design. And that's one thing we'll talk about. And then you can kind of see a lot of the other applied finishes. As this is a workplace project for a tech company, they kind of expect the best, and they want the workplace that's going to attract employees. So you really can be challenged working on a project like this to kind of not overdo it. So kind of that idea of use less is something that we brought to the table early, and the client is on board with the sustainability strategy. So we're really trying to be reserved in the way that we approach the project, while trying to also create like a really welcoming and warm space for the employees there. So I think we have another slide with a few reference images here just to take a look at. Really some kind of fun and exciting areas. You have kind of a little kitchenette space here on the right, and then some more alternate workspace with some tiered seating and things like that. So let's go on to the next slide. This is referring back to the first of the 3 steps that I mentioned, which is use less. And this is a little, probably a little small for a lot of you to see, but it's just an idea of something that we're doing. Because we have so much of this linear wood slat system, early on in the project, we worked to really optimize how much of it we needed. We understood that kind of the intensity of installing something like this, you could be talking about trucks and trucks of logs coming out of the forest, and whether that is even available, you might be really putting a heavy burden on your local forest. So we kind of looked at the spacing, we looked at the depth, using the fact that we're modeling all these things in Revit, we're very easily able to quantify the cubic footage of material, and then look at the renderings side by side and say, do we really need these wood slats to be 8 inches deep, or can they be 4 inches deep and just spaced a little bit tighter, and then see how much material that is. And even before you've tied this into the tally software and assigned the species of wood, or whether it's solid stock or if it's plywood core with veneer on it, you can pretty easily see just how much you're using. So this is something that I think is accessible to a lot of designers as a tool, just kind of using the software that's at hand. So that's use less. Let's go on to the next slide. This is choose well. So here we're talking a little about carpeting and a little bit about wood. Carpeting, fortunately, is pretty easy, pretty straightforward these days. I don't want to speak, I'm not trying to kind of speak for any brand or any one product, but we've been working with Interface, and they've really been kind of an industry leader, coming to us and representing to say, hey, look at this data that we have done and sourced. We are the ones that provide the best material. So, if someone comes to us with that information, we're pretty excited about using something like that based on the goals for the project. So I wouldn't say it's always that easy. And as Mike said, a lot of it is very mysterious, and we don't have all the answers, but sometimes it's that straightforward as updating your specs to kind of use the lowest carbon footprint material while also considering the life cycle. On the wood side, we are working with FSC, of course. Microsoft requires that all their wood be FSC, and it would be wrong of me not to thank our partners over at Sustainable Northwest Wood. Terry has fielded a lot of emails from me about helping out with this. And then because we're using so much white oak on the project as well, we've been in communication with the Oak Accord and all that they're doing to protect the white oak habitat in the Northwest. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about our third, which is consider the details. So this one is a little bit more in the weeds, but something that we're pretty excited about. This is just a partition wall assembly, you know, metal studs with that insulation and sheetrock over the face. This is, you know, we did a study here on a 10 by 10 wall, but we have thousands of feet of these walls in these projects, so they're kind of an easy target to come at. And what I'm trying to drive at here on the right is a graph. On the left, you can kind of see the makeup. The blue is the sheetrock, the green is the insulation, and the red is the metal studs. And through working with our acoustician and our structural engineers, we were able to achieve a 26% reduction in global warming potential of our typical interior partition wall, simply through optimizing the product selection and ensuring that those values were held. So we use lightweight sheetrock, we use 24-inch on center spacing over 16, we use EQ studs, the fiberglass bats remain the same. And something like this is, you know, something that takes a little time to get into, but being able to cut out a quarter of the global warming potential of a wall that is used kind of throughout the project and might be torn down and replaced every 15 years is something that is really exciting to us because it's just something that you can take off the top and apply to all your projects in the future. So we're just kind of happy to be able to study these things and apply them to the project. With that, I want to talk just briefly about the results that we're getting. So we'll go on to the next slide here. And this is something that's new to us. This is a sheet from our 100% DD set. So we are now kind of tracking carbon intensity. And this is this is the output from Tally in Revit. So you can kind of see here that, you know, it's a way for us to kind of track at our milestones, how we're doing, and then we can refer back and see where we were and where we're going. So to step forward, we'll look a little bit at the detail of those results. And here you can kind of see two columns on the left. One is the mass and one is the global warming potential. Global warming potential is really the tool we use to track the carbon impact of these projects. And we've broken this down into three categories, primarily ceilings, walls, doors, and windows, and flooring. And right now, the global warming potential of the building is somewhere around 1.5 million kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which is a number that without reference is really hard to kind of understand. So the next slide is what we're really excited about. And this is something that we're using to kind of set a benchmark or understand how we're doing. Because we can always say like, well, at SD, we were here and now we're here and we're going there. So we can kind of fine tune in that way. But we also did an analysis comparing the project we're working on currently, which is on the right, to a project that we did a few years ago for the same client in the same place for generally the same program, which has a very equivalent size. So just running through these numbers, that project was about 200,000 square feet. This one is the same. However, the global warming potential of that project was around 2.5 million, and here we're 1.5 million. So normalized for the area of the building, we're looking at about a 37% reduction in carbon impact on that. So that's something that we're excited about. We're kind of really just kind of excited to keep going and to study this more and to look at more projects and compare them back so we can see where we've been. And this is new to us, so you know the science isn't fully locked down, but we're going to keep developing in this. We can keep focusing on carbon as we move forward.
Fabulous. Thank you, Garrett, for walking us through so much great detail. You guys have been able to dig really deeply on this project, and it's great to see. We don't have any specific questions that have come through yet, but one that I was hoping that you could maybe touch on, or I will encourage others as well, to just think about the efforts that have been done on this project regarding our understanding about carbon and how we see applying that to other projects in our office in the future. Maybe either with a client who has similar goals or a client maybe who is new to the idea of really looking at carbon impacts.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think I should preface by saying that, you know, similar to when LEED was introduced by USGBC, a lot of the requirements for what they were doing were around reporting. It wasn't really about even trying to do well. It was really just trying to understand your impact. And I feel like as carbon is kind of becoming the thing that we talk about now, we're in a similar spot where it's really, you know, that's what we need to bring to the client to say, you know, our goal here is to acknowledge what we're doing to the environment through the construction process here. So I think that's a good place to start. But from our end, I think it's pretty easy. You know, we're learning the tools. We know the tools. We can apply that to any project because we draw the projects in the same software, so we can kind of repeat, learn from our mistakes, and keep developing there. And things like the partition wall study that we've developed on this project, I've been bugging Mike about this. I don't think there's any reason we can't drive that into all our other projects and just kind of get that clean, you know, 26% reduction off the top. So I think the more we expand it to everyone in our office, the easier it will get.
Excellent. Well, we've had a couple of questions come through, and I see Mike's video is back on, and so hopefully he can help answer some of these. A great one from Jordan Palmieri. Are you seeing any synergies in product categories that have both low carbon products and are also preferred from a health perspective?
I'll just point out the one that Garrett just talked about, the lightweight drywall product that we're using at Microsoft also is red list free product with a declare label. So, you know, they are out there, and that's really what we're trying to capture in the material selection guides, that once we sort of get all of this research input into those guides, that will be a clear picture of where those, you know, both of those key drivers are hitting well.
Excellent. Anyone else? Any observations?
I would just echo Mike's sentiment. I think we see a lot of the same companies that are focused on health also are focused on carbon. So we see kind of a doubling down on the good of those materials.
All right. So also in this vein of synergy between some of these different topics, we have a question. In talking about equity, have you happened upon any more affordable products that also have great sustainable qualities? If not, how do you think we can make these leading edge products more available?
You know, that is really the focus of the HBN's Home Free program, because of their focus on affordable housing. So that's a place to start, to look and see where the products that they recommend meet both of those kind of criteria. Let's see. Yeah, and I think, you know, that's the ultimate goal, right? Is we want healthy materials, we want low carbon materials, and we want them to be the least expensive option. So there's a lot of work to do, but I think, you know, the first steps are learning how to categorize these things and understand them and get the data about them and how to measure them, and then we can drive the industry towards the ones that meet those criteria the best.
Yeah, and I'll get in trouble if I talk too much about partition wall assemblies, but I think it should be. I don't think I noted this. You know, that assembly it's the lowest carbon option. It's the healthier option because of the wallboard, and it also is less expensive. So it's kind of, you know, there's nothing wrong with it as long as our acoustician and our structural engineer sign off on it. We're like, let's do it. So I think those things are tied together more than we might assume.
Yeah, the only other thing maybe I'll add in thinking about this equity question is just the impact on local communities and local economies. So just thinking about where products are coming from and the source can be that kind of combination of equity trade-offs. The first dollar cost doesn't necessarily equivalent to long-term benefits. All right, a few more questions here. This is probably a question more for Garrett. Great to see the power in a typical assembly carbon analysis. Curious if you considered the logistics of integrating the material health lens into this. So kind of actually both a question for Mike and Garrett. In that I'm not exactly sure, because I'm not worked specifically in Tally, if that's even an option to categorize.
Yeah, I don't know that it is in Tally itself. And I think Mike may have already answered this question partially through kind of talking about the material that's going into that assembly. But there's always more work to do to draw all three of these lenses together on our projects, for sure.
I suppose you could put some of this criteria in your materials as you build them in Revit and maybe pull out something that way. I don't know, we haven't tried that, but yeah. That would be an interesting maybe way to do that, to sort of the way Tally pulls out the carbon information. If you could build some sort of health information in there that you could also pull out in a similar way, you could do sort of some of the same type of graphing that you were doing with the carbon study.
Yeah.
All right, sounds like we have some ideas for how to improve Tally or create some other new system out there. Another question, what is more significant, the embodied carbon or the carbon footprint of a building?
That's a great question. I think this is the reason everyone is talking about embodied carbon now, is because we spend a lot of time talking about energy consumption and energy efficiency in buildings. And assuming that this question is asking about the carbon footprint of the building, assuming the fuel it takes to run the building. The idea is that as buildings become more efficient over time, they won't use very much energy, right, to run on an annual basis. But the embodied carbon that you put into the project from the start is there forever. So that's really why the idea is that, and there's really great graphs online to describe this, but that embodied carbon will take you a very, very long time to pay off. So if you can kind of bring that number down from the get-go, your energy efficiency over time will only get better. So we aren't trying to say one is more important than the other, but we think that they're both very important. We're trying to bring embodied carbon up to the forefront now because it hasn't been a topic we discussed in the past.
Excellent. One quick question. There was an ask for a repeat of the manufacturer of the wall partition.
I will answer that one through typing. I'll put the USG number in there for you.
Okay, great. Awesome. Add that to the chat for whoever asked. One more question. Great presentation all around. Well, thank you for the kudos, everybody. Our study of agency for health impacts and materials and categories was interesting. Have the results helped Bora prioritize specific material categories in our projects? Mike, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, adjacencies of health impacts. I think it does sort of drive us to prioritize those interior materials, which were the ones that we focused on in this health study, because those are the ones that people touch and breathe adjacent to when they're in the building. And so I think that's the question here, but yeah. So for sure, we like in the Microsoft project, even looking at the wood and the carpet in terms of carbon, we're also looking at those in terms of health, and making sure that because they're when you're in the building, they're all around you, so they're pretty important in that regard.
Yeah, I know there has been some discussion just even in the last couple of weeks about our office does a lot of work in the performing arts realm, and that there are a lot of material categories that relate to that, such as maybe acoustical panels, that there isn't as much prevalent data out there on or guides per se. So that's been a category that we've been prioritizing just specific to our work. And I know that there are a few others. Mike mentioned visual display because of our education markets. as well as others, just materials that people do come in contact with, and being really thoughtful about exposure potential in that work. Well, there aren't any other questions in the queue right now. I just want to maybe open up to the panelists. If you guys have any other closing remarks you guys want to share.
Actually, Amy, there were a couple of questions that got moved into the answered column that I don't think we addressed. That I saw earlier that have since been sort of typed over. But one was about which green building standards you typically consider LEED, BREEAM, WELL, et cetera, and how can they be improved. I don't have a ton of experience with any of these except LEED. We haven't done a BREEAM project or a WELL project yet. I've looked into it a little bit, but I'm not that familiar with their health criteria. But LEED, you know, the Health Product Declaration Collaborative organized a study on the LEED health credits a couple years ago, and really came up with some suggestions that have since been rolled into a pilot credit that basically looks at rating all of the sort of nuance of how manufacturers are reporting their content. So this level of disclosure, 100 parts per million versus 1,000 parts per million, for example, and whether they're doing a nested display or just a basic display of their content, and whether it's third-party verified or not. Those kinds of things all adding into essentially a way to sort of award each incremental step that is better, and then also looking at how to award incremental steps in terms of optimization of products too, so that, you know, everybody, essentially manufacturers, you know, not everybody's able to be at the same place at this time. Everybody's sort of working at their own pace of what they can do. And so being able to give people credit where some credit is due, but also give people more credit where they've done more. And that was the idea of the pilot credit that's out there. And in that discussion, the version 4.1, version of those credits was improved as part of that process, so that, you know, some of the options that used to be not really attainable now are attainable, and also are starting to reward and encourage more of that types of reporting and better optimization. And I will say also that LEED is probably one of the biggest drivers right now of HPDs and things like that, because that's project teams are asking for them for their LEED projects. So I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add to that, but. And then there was one other question from Terry. Are there any policy efforts in Oregon or at the federal level to ban certain chemicals and building materials? And I'll just say, you know, everybody's probably seen this graph that shows this big circle that represents the 80,000 chemicals that are in the industry, or that out in the market, in the global industry, not just the building industry. And there's a much smaller circle of the couple hundred that have been tested for human health, and then the little tiny circle of about 5 that any sort of action has really been taken on, and not even outright bans on some of those things. So for example, if you just look at lead, you know, lead is it's not used in paint anymore, but, you know, if you look at plumbing fixtures, lead free, you know, doesn't mean zero lead. It means some small amount percentage of lead. And yet there really is no safe exposure level of lead. So there's still, you know, the government has not moved quickly enough on some of these issues. And I don't know about Oregon. I don't know, you know, California does a lot of things because of their giant economy. You know, they're able to sort of make rules that kind of affect everybody. I'm not sure if Oregon has that much clout, but be interesting to see if that would work out.
Yeah, personally, I've also been tracking some of not necessarily the building industry initiatives, but other things in human-related product categories. There's currently some legislation in California regarding the cosmetics industry and banning certain chemicals within that realm. And I think, as Terry points out, it is actually the most equitable way to think about material avoidance, really setting parameters that have to be mandated by the government and then, held to in all different project types, really affecting those who don't have that ability to make those kinds of decisions in general. All right. Well, Jamie or Garrett, any last words that you want to share?
No, just thank you for everybody attending.
Thank you all.
Yeah, it
for
looks
the
like
time.
we had about 56, 57 participants at one point during the presentation.
Awesome.
Garrett, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just thanking everyone for their time. Appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today.
Definitely, and we really thank the Sustainable Building Week for all the events that they're hosting this week. Please check out some others. I'll give a quick plug for the Portland Materials Transparency Workshop on Friday, which would be fabulous. Some amazing speakers talking about a wide range of material related issues, and Terry will be speaking at that as well. So, all right, everyone, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank you.
you.